Hare Krishna devotees, welcome to day 16 of our Bhakti Vaibhava seminar on Srimad Bhagavatam, third canto. And we are in the sixth chapter. We are in the sixth chapter of the third canto, which is titled Creation of the Universal Form. And Maitreya is explaining how the Lord took the forms of the demigods. And that section, it's the second section, from verse 11 to verse 25, so we're starting with verse 11. First of all, though, let us chant our prayers. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pastya Chadesh Tarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadha Shivas Adi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchakalpatarubhyas cha kripa sindhubhya eva cha. Patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. All right, devotees, so second section, then Maitreya explains how the Lord took the forms of the demigods from verse 11 to verse 25. And at the end of the day yesterday, we read through all the verses, just the translations. So now we'll go through in detail. So verse 11, Maitreya said, "You can now hear from me how the Supreme Lord separated himself into the diverse forms of the demigods after the manifestation of the gigantic universal form." So yes, there's a purport here, short purport. The demigods are separated parts and parcels of the Lord, like all other living entities, yeah. The only difference between the demigods and the ordinary living entities like us is that when living entities, that when the living entities, Prabhupada says, are rich in pious acts of devotional service to the Lord, and their desire to lord it over material nature has vanished, they can become demigods. They are promoted to the posts of demigods, or can be. And there they're entrusted by the Lord with executing the management of the universal affairs. All right, so on to verse 12. Agni, or heat, separated from his mouth, his mouth being that of the universal form. Agni, or heat, separated from his mouth, and all the directors of material affairs entered into it in their respective positions. By that energy, the living entity expresses himself in words. So, yes, again, there's actually a very short purport indeed. So the mouth of the universal form is the source of the speaking power, and the director of the element fire is the controlling deity, or Adidaiva. And the speeches delivered are Adhyatma, or bodily functions, and the subject of the speeches is material production, or the Adibhuta principle. Yes. On to verse 13. When the palette of the gigantic form was separately manifested, Varuna, the director of water in the planetary systems, entered therein. And thus the living entity has the facility to taste everything with his tongue. There's no purport to verse 13, and indeed for the next 3 verses, there's no purport. Let's just read verses 14, 15, and 16. When the Lord's 2 nostrils separately manifested themselves, the dual Ashvini Kumars entered them in their proper positions. And because of this, the living entities can smell the aromas of everything. 15. Thereafter, the 2 eyes of the gigantic form of the Lord were separately manifested. The sun, the director of light, entered them with the partial representation of eyesight, and thus the living entities can have vision of forms. 16. When there was a manifestation of skin separated from the gigantic form, Anila, the deity directing the wind, entered with partial touch, and thus the living entities can realize tactile knowledge. Tactile means by touching. Right, and verse 17. When the ears of the gigantic form became manifested, all the controlling deities of the directions entered into them with the hearing principles, by which all the living entities hear and take advantage of sound. Okay, so there's a short purport here, and Prabhupada makes really important point that the ear is the most important instrument in the body of the living entity. Sound is the most important medium for carrying messages, information of distant or unknown things, or, anything really. And the perfection of all sound or knowledge enters through the ear, and in this way one's life becomes perfect. Means knowledge of Krishna consciousness, of course. Sound vibrations of Krishna consciousness. The entire Vedic system of knowledge is received by oral reception only. So sound is the most important source of knowledge. And as Srila Prabhupada said on a number of occasions, we see through our ears, not through our eyes. We see through our ears. And Prabhupada gives the example that the sun, we can look in the sky right now, the sun is there, and we can see this little round thing. It's just a very small little disc, looks like a coin. But when we hear about it from truly informed sources, then we understand that the sun is huge, it's gigantic, it's just much bigger than the Earth planet. Okay, so sound is the most important source of knowledge. Verse 18, when there was a separate manifestation of skin, the controlling deities of sensations and their different parts entered into it, and thus the living entities feel itching and happiness due to touch. Yes. Krishna. So Prabhupada begins the purport by saying that for sense perception, there are 2 principal items. 2 principal items. Touch and itching. Okay, anyway, that's a bit of an unusual point, but let's see what Prabhupada says further about it. So both of them, touch and itching, are controlled by the skin and the hairs on the body. And Prabhupada refers to Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, who says, the controlling deity of touch is air, passing within the body. Wow. The controlling deity of touch is the air passing within the body. And the controlling deity of the hairs on the body is Oshadhya. For the skin, the object of perception is touch, and for the hairs on the body, the object of perception is itching. All right. So on we go. I mean, that's a bit esoteric. But anyway, let's carry on. Let us carry on. Verse 19. When the genitals of the gigantic form separately became manifest, then Prajapati, the original living creature, entered into them with his partial semen, and thus the living entities can enjoy sex pleasure. Now there's a number of verses coming up which don't have purports. 20. The evacuating channel separately became manifest, and the director named Mitra entered into it with partial organs of evacuation. Thus the living entities are able to pass stool and urine. 21. Thereafter, when the hands of the gigantic form separately became manifested, Indra, the ruler of the heavenly planets, entered into them, and thus the living entity is able to transact business for his livelihood. 22. Thereafter the legs of the gigantic form separately became manifest, and the demigod named Vishnu, Prabhupada notes, not the personality of Godhead, entered with partial movement. This helps the living entity move to his destination. 23. When the intelligence of the gigantic form separately became manifest, this is there in each verse, you may have noticed, separately, these different things separately became manifest. So the intelligence then, when it became separately manifest, Brahma, the Lord of the Vedas, entered into it with the partial power of understanding. And thus an object of understanding is experienced by the living entities. 24. After that, the heart of the gigantic form separately manifested itself, and into it entered the moon demigod with partial mental activity. Thus the living entity can conduct his mental speculations. Okay, then now verse 25 is the last verse in this section, and it does have a purport. Thereafter the materialistic ego of the gigantic form separately manifested itself, and into it entered Rudra, the controller of false ego, with his own partial activities, by which the living entity transacts his objective actions. Right, so it's not a big purport, but it's a purport. Prabhupada begins by saying that the false ego is controlled by Rudra. He controls, well, he's an incarnation of Lord Shiva, and he controls the mode of ignorance. He's also a type of incarnation of the Supreme Lord. So, most people are conducted by false ego, or we should say, most people who are conducted by false ego are controlled by Lord Shiva. When a person reaches a finer version of ignorance, he falsely thinks of himself as the Supreme Lord. That's just a very special way of putting things. A finer version of ignorance. He thinks he's God. Oh gosh. So that's the last snare of Maya, which is controlling the entire material world. All right, so now section 3, how the planets manifested. I'll just read through. The first 2 verses have no purports. Let's just read through verses 26, 27, 28, and 29. 26. Thereafter, when his consciousness separately manifested itself, the total energy Mahatattva entered with his conscious part. Thus the living entity is able to conceive specific knowledge due to the presence of consciousness. 27. Thereafter, from the head of the gigantic form, the heavenly planets were manifested, and from his legs the earthly planets, and from his abdomen the sky separately manifested themselves. Within them the demigods and others also were manifested in terms of the modes of material nature. Verse 28. The demigods, qualified by the super excellent quality of the mode of goodness, are situated in the heavenly planets, whereas the human beings, because of their nature in the mode of passion, live on the earth in company with their subordinates. Right, so there's a purport here. So Prabhupada refers to Bhagavad Gita chapter 14, verses 14 and 15, which say that those who are really highly situated in the mode of goodness go to the higher planets. Yes. Whereas those who are overpowered by passion, they are situated in the middle planetary systems like Earth and others similar. And those who are surcharged by the mode of ignorance, they become degraded to lower planetary systems, or even to the animal kingdom. So the demigods, though, they're highly developed in the mode of goodness, not just sort of average mode of goodness, but highly developed in goodness. So they're situated in the heavenly planets, but below the humans are the animals, some of which sort of associate, you could say, with humans. And they're habituated to living under the protection of humans. Yeah, okay. And of course, they're in ignorance. Well, Prabhupada says that by excessive development of the modes of passion and ignorance, human beings become inclined to kill animals who are meant to be protected by humans. And those who do that, indulge in that unnecessary animal killing, they're too much in passion and ignorance, and they have no hope of advancing to the mode of goodness. This is the second paragraph, by the way. So they're destined, those people who are too much in passion and ignorance, who indulge in unnecessary animal killing. They are destined to be degraded to the lower statuses of life. And Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying that the planetary systems are calculated as upper and lower in terms of the classes of living entities living there. Verse 29, living entities who are associates of Rudra develop in the third mode of material nature or ignorance. They're situated in the sky between the earthly planets and the heavenly planets. Wow, okay. So Srila Prabhupada makes the point that this middle part of the universe is called Bhuvaloka, and it's confirmed by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, Jiva Goswami, and Bhagavad Gita says that those who develop in the mode of passion, they're situated in the middle region. Those who are in goodness, they get promoted to the demigod regions. Those in passion, they're in human society. Those in ignorance, they get placed in the society of animals or ghosts. Yeah, and there's no contradictions in this. And, you see how certain people, they're just really gross. Just really gross and tamasic. The heavy metal people, the people into zombie things. They're on the way. They are on their ways. A lot of them to becoming ghosts and other, really low, ghoulish, unpleasant sort of people, but they don't have the qualities of people. So anyway, Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, numerous living entities are distributed all over the universe in different planets and are so situated in terms of their own qualities in the modes of material nature. So on we go. Section 4, the Varnas within the universal form, from verse 30 to verse 34. And again, it's a short section. I think I'll just read straight through. Verse 30. O chief of the Kuru dynasty, that's Maitreya addressing Vidura. O chief of the Kuru dynasty, the Vedic wisdom became manifested from the mouth of the Virat, the gigantic form, the universal form. Those who are inclined to this Vedic knowledge are called Brahmins, and they are the natural teachers and spiritual masters of all the orders of society. Okay, so Srila Prabhupada gives a somewhat substantial purport here. So first of all, Bhagavad Gita 4:13, Chaturvanyam Bayasishtam Gunakama Vibhagasha, that the four orders, Varnas, the Varnas, they're developed within the order of the body of the universal form. So the bodily divisions, how they're all divided up, the Varnas, those who are situated on the mouth are Brahmins, those situated on the arms are Kshatriyas, those situated on the waist are Vaishyas, and those situated on the legs are Sudras. So, in other words, everyone is situated on the universal form. Yeah. And Prabhupada makes interesting point that none of those Varnas, Brahman, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Sudras, none of them can really be considered degraded because they're on different parts of the body of the Lord. And in our bodies, when we look at our bodies, we don't really make distinctions in terms of how we treat the different parts. Our hands, our legs, our head, every part of the body is important, although the mouth is the most important. Prabhupada makes the point that if some parts of the body are cut off, like hands, legs, these things happen sometimes, we can survive. But if the mouth is cut off, we can't live. Therefore, the most important part of the body is the sitting place of the Brahmins, who incline towards Vedic wisdom. So anyone who's not inclined to Vedic wisdom, but rather to mundane affairs, doesn't qualify to be a Brahmin, even if born of a Brahmin family. To have a Brahmin father doesn't qualify you to be a Brahmin, just as to have a father who's a doctor doesn't mean that you're a doctor. A father who is a surgeon, expert in operations, just because he's your father doesn't mean you're qualified to do operations. So the Vedas are situated on the mouth, and therefore anyone who's inclined towards the Vedas is also situated on the mouth and is therefore a Brahmin. So Prabhupada makes the point, such a well-known point. Anyone from any family or from any part of the world may become inclined to the Vedic wisdom, and in this way be qualified to be a Brahmin. So Prabhupada goes on, second paragraph, the real Brahmin is a natural teacher or spiritual master. And if you don't have Vedic knowledge, you can't be a spiritual master. So what is that knowledge, that Vedic knowledge? Prabhupada says that perfect Vedic knowledge is to know the Lord. That's the end of knowledge, or Vedanta. By all the Vedas, Krishna says, I am to be known. So if one is situated in the impersonal Brahman, not in knowledge of the Lord, but in the impersonal Brahman, and has no information about the Lord, may become a Brahmin, but can't become a spiritual master. Padma Prana states, let me just read it, it's a famous verse. It appears also in Nectar of Devotion. Sat karma nipuno vipro mantra tantra visharada, a Vaishnavo guru nasyad, Vaishnava swapacho guru. An impersonalist can become a qualified Brahmin, but he cannot become a spiritual master unless and until he is promoted to the stage of a Vaishnav or a devotee of the personality of Godhead. And Prabhupada quotes Lord Chaitanya, the great authority of Vedic wisdom in the modern age. Lord Chaitanya said, Kiba vipra kiba nyasi shudra kene noi, ye Krishna tattva veta se guru hoy. That a person may be Brahmin, Sudra, Sannyasi, or whatever, but if the person happens to be well versed in the science of Krishna, then he's fit to become a spiritual master. This is Madhya Lila Chaitanya Charitamrita 8:128. So the qualification then of a spiritual master is not to be a qualified Brahmin, but to know the science of Krishna, to be well versed in the science of Krishna. And then there's a very short third paragraph. Srila Prabhupada says, One who's conversant with Vedic wisdom is a Brahmin, and only a Brahmin who's a pure Vaishnav and knows all the intricacies of the science of Krishna can become a spiritual master. So on we go to verse 31. Thereafter, the power of protection was generated from the arms of the gigantic Virat form, and in relation to such power, the Kshatriyas also came into existence by following the Kshatriya principle of protecting society from the disturbance of thieves and miscreants. Right, okay, so previously, just now, we were talking about the Brahmins coming from the universal form. Now it's the Kshatriyas. And their particular point is protecting society physically, whereas the Brahmins are recognized by their inclination towards transcendental knowledge. Anyway, okay, so we talked about the Brahmins. So a Kshatriya, let me just say that the term Kshatriya, Shat means pain or hurt, and Triya comes from the root or the form Triyate, which means to protect. So Kshatriya is someone then who protects people from physical pain. So anyway, in the first paragraph, the word, Prabhupada says, the word anuvrata is significant. It means they follow the Kshatriya principles. They're not just born Kshatriya. You know, there are people around. In Hindu society, there are definitely people who identify themselves as Kshatriyas, but they are not Kshatriyas. A lot of them are businessmen. Yeah. So the caste system then is, Prabhupada uses the term here, it's always based on quality, not on birth. The birth is just not part of it. Birth is not related. Prabhupada says it's an extraneous consideration. Yeah. And Bhagavad Gita, we won't go through the whole thing, but Prabhupada notes that in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 18, verses 41 to 44, Lord Krishna explains clearly the qualifications of the Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Sudras. And we understand that the qualifications, the specific qualifications of whichever varna are required if a person is to be recognized as a member of that varna. All right, so we go on to the second paragraph. And Prabhupada makes the point that Lord Vishnu is always mentioned as the Purusha in Vedic scriptures, although sometimes we, the living entities, are also referred to as Purushas. Although Prabhupada says the living entities are essentially Purusha Shakti, which can be either Parashakti or Paraprakriti, the superior energy of the Purusha. Yes. Otherwise, under the influence of illusion, living entities, or some of them, so many of them really, they falsely think of themselves as Purushas, although they don't have the qualifications at all. So anyway, the Lord has the power to protect. The Kshatriyas are expected to represent the Purusha Lord, so they're referred to here as Purusha or Purusha. The Kshatriyas are expected to represent the Purusha. Therefore, they're referred to as Purusha here. But now the living entities are not protected like that. The Kshatriyas, or so-called Kshatriyas, they're not doing their job. Well, they're not really what they're trying to be designated as. And the governments are governments of Vaishyas and Sudras, not Brahmins and Kshatriyas. But Yudhisthira and Parikshit, they were typical Kshatriyas, giving protection to all. And the classic example, I mean, there's so many classic examples, is Maharaj Parikshit being just immediately ready to kill the personality of Kali, who was acting as if he was some higher class person, but he wasn't. He was just a Sudra. So Parikshit immediately acted. That's the sign of a real Purusha, representative of the Lord. So the Vedic standard is that, according to Vedic civilization, a qualified Kshatriya monarch is given the respect of the Lord, because he represents the Lord by giving protection to the prajas, whereas the modern elected presidents, they can't even give protection from thieves. You need to take out an insurance policy. In South Africa, we should have insurance policies against so-called load shedding. It is pathetic. There's no electricity, sometimes half the day. Anyway, so Prabhupada concludes the purport by pointing out how the problems of modern society are due to the lack of qualified Brahmins and Kshatriyas and the over-influence of Vaishyas and Sudras. Verse 32, the means of livelihood of all persons, namely the production of grains and their distribution to the prajas, was generated from the thighs of the Lord's gigantic form. The mercantile men who take charge of such execution are called Vaishyas. Prabhupada points out that human society's means of living is clearly mentioned here as Visha, or agriculture, and the business of distributing agricultural products, which involves transport, banking, etc. It's very interesting. Prabhupada makes the point that industry is an artificial means of livelihood, and large-scale industry is the source of all problems of society. So in Bhagavad Gita, 18th chapter, the duties of the Vaishyas who are engaged in Visha are stated as cow protection, agriculture, and business. And Prabhupada says, we've already discussed that the human being can safely depend on the cow and agricultural land for his livelihood. So transport is also included. The exchange of produce by banking and transportation is a branch of the Vaishya way of life. So then Srila Prabhupada lists out a number of subgroups of Vaishyas. First of all, they're the Kshatri landowners. Then there's the Krishna, or land tillers. Some are called Tilavanik, or the grain growers, grain raisers, basically grain growers. Some are called Gandha Vanik, merchants in spices, and some are called Suvarna Vanik, merchants in gold and banking. And the Sudras, of course. So Prabhupada makes the point. The Brahmins are the teachers and spiritual masters. Kshatriyas protect the citizens physically. Vaishyas are in charge of production and distribution. Then the Sudras not intelligent people, can't act independently. They just serve the three higher classes, Brahman, Kshatriya, and Vaishya. Yes, so then third paragraph, that previously, formerly, the Brahmins were given everything they needed by the Kshatriyas and Vaishyas. They're too busy teaching and helping people like that to make a living by just laboring or doing business or something. So the Kshatriyas would collect taxes from the Vaishyas and Sudras, but the Brahmins were exempt, and they would then be supported from those taxes. So it was a very nice system, and as a result, there were no political, social, or economic upheavals. So for peaceful human society, you need all these four varnas. Verse 33. Thereafter, service was manifested from the legs of the personality of Godhead for the sake of perfecting the religious function. Situated on the legs are the Sudras, who satisfy the Lord by service. Right, so there's a reasonably substantial, fairly substantial purport here. First point Prabhupada makes is that service is the real constitutional engagement for all living entities, to serve the Lord. And in this way, one can attain religious perfection. You can't just get that perfection by speculating, mental speculation for theoretical knowledge. And as Prabhupada does so many times, he discusses briefly the Jnani division of spiritualists, the speculators. They speculate to distinguish soul from matter, but they have no information of the activities of the soul after liberation from matter by that knowledge. Yeah, once you understand that you're actually spirit soul and you're not part of the material world, then what? You just don't do anything because you're not part of the material world? So Prabhupada makes the point that such speculators who don't engage in devotional service, they're just wasting their time. So then the second paragraph, here it's stated that the principle of service came from the legs of the Lord for the sake of perfecting the religion. But this service is different from material service in the material world. In the material world, no one wants to be a servant. They all want to be master. That is at least a perspective on the basic disease of conditioned souls, how to lord it over. They want to lord it over, but then they're forced to become a servant. Yeah. The Sudras, of course, they have to become servants. The Vaishyas have to be servants. And the Kshatriyas also, they have to serve. Otherwise, the Kshatriyas, the government people, if they don't serve the people in general and look after them, they get kicked out and someone else takes over. So Prabhupada then, so Prabhupada concludes this paragraph by saying that the last snare of the illusory external energy is the conception of becoming one to the Lord. And due to this conception, the illusion soul remains in Maya, even though they may think they're liberated. And then the third paragraph, and this is really interesting. This is just really important. Let me just read how Prabhupada begins the paragraph. It is actually better to be a Sudra than to be a Brahmin and not develop the service attitude, because that attitude alone satisfies the Lord. So therefore, every living entity, whatever their qualification is, every living entity, even if they're qualified Brahmins, they must take up service to the Lord. And what to speak of Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Sudras. The Brahmins are supposed to know this due to their being very knowledgeable in Vedic wisdom. And then the other groups, the other Varnas, should follow the directions of the Brahmin Vaishnav. And in this way, even if you're not perfect, not a perfect Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, or Sudra, but you have a service attitude, and you take to the service of the Lord, and you don't care about your social position and perfecting your social position, such a person, whatever they are, even if they're not perfect Brahmin, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, or Sudras, they can become perfect human beings simply by developing the attitude of service to the Lord. Right, and on to verse 34. All these different social divisions are born with their occupational duties and living conditions from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Thus, for unconditional life and self-realization, one has to worship the Supreme Lord under the direction of the spiritual master. Right, so that's pretty powerful. So Prabhupada begins the purport by saying that since all these different social divisions, the Varnas, are born from different parts of the body of the Lord in the universal form, so all living entities are supposed to be eternal servitors of Prabhupada says, the supreme body, or you could say of the universal form. And every part of our body is meant to serve the whole. That's the constitutional position of our bodies. Mouth, hands, thighs, legs. Yeah. Of course, in lower species, they don't know about this. They're not conscious of their constitutional position as servants. But in the human form, they're meant to know. Right. So Brahminical culture should be there, so people can get knowledge from genuine authoritative Brahmins, and that will then culminate in service to the Lord, and the people will become purified. So, right, on to the second paragraph. And again, Prabhupada makes the point that the conditioned souls, they're pretty convinced they can become lords of the universe. But unfortunately, there's all sorts of misconceptions they have. The last point of misconception is to think that you are the supreme, but they don't take into consideration that how can the supreme be conditioned by illusion? If that happens, how can he be supreme? Then Maya would be supreme. So therefore all the conditioned souls, they're impure due to contact with Maya, and they need to become purified by the guidance of a spiritual master, a bona fide, real spiritual master, who's not only a Brahmin, but is a Vaishnav. And that's it. No other process is recommended. Yes. But worshipping the Lord under the spiritual master. Other methods, there are other methods which may help to some degree or not, but they may help to come to this point. But this is the only way, this purification through devotional service under a Brahmin Vaishnav spiritual master. That's the only way to come to the actual perfection. And Bhagavad Gita chapter 7 verse 19 confirms this truth as follows. And of course, you should know by now that this verse is quoted, sometimes fully here, it's fully quoted, at least the Sanskrit, sometimes partially or just referred to. So often, we've already come across it many times. Bhagavad Gita chapter 7 verse 19. After many births and deaths, one who's actually in knowledge understands Krishna to be the source of everything, Vasudeva, and therefore that Vasudeva is the source of everything and surrenders to him. And such a great soul is very rare. All right, so let's go on to the last section. I think it's the last section, verse 35 to verse 40. It's the last section. Let's go on to it. I don't think we'll be able to finish it today. Let's run through the verses. Verse 35. O Vidura, who can estimate or measure the transcendental time, work, and potency of the gigantic form manifested by the internal potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead? 36. In spite of my ability, whatever I've been able to hear from the spiritual master, and whatever I could assimilate, I am now describing in glorification of the Lord by pure speech. For otherwise my power of speaking would remain unchaste. 37. The highest perfectional gain of humanity is to engage in discussions of the activities and glories of the pious actor, with capital first letters means the Lord. Such activities are so nicely arranged in writing by the greatly learned sages that the actual purpose of the air is served just by being near them. 38. O my son, the original poet Brahma, after mature meditation for 1,000 celestial years, could know only that the glories of the Supreme Soul are inconceivable. After meditating for 1,000 celestial years. 39. The wonderful potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is bewildering even to the jugglers. That potential power is unknown even to the self-sufficient Lord. So it is certainly unknown to others. Verse 40. Words, mind, and ego, with their respective controlling demigods, have failed to achieve success in knowing the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, we simply have to offer our respectful obeisances unto him as a matter of sanity. Yeah, otherwise you're insane. That's pretty emphatic, isn't it? Okay, so let's read through verse 35. We've got enough time. So the section is titled The Inconceivable Nature of the Lord. It's verse 35 to verse 40. Here's 35. O Vidura, who can estimate or measure the transcendental time, work, and potency of the gigantic form manifested by the internal potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead? So, Prabhupada, in the first paragraph, revisits the famous example of Dr. Frog, the froggish philosophers down the well, and their friend Frog went and saw the Pacific Ocean and came back and reported back to the Dr. Frog, who's in his well and who thinks the well is just the greatest. And he says, the one who saw the ocean says, I saw the ocean, it's huge. It's gigantic, so much bigger than this well. And Dr. Frog said, well, is it bigger than this well? Yes, it's much bigger. And then Dr. Frog started puffing up his chest. Is it this big? Much bigger. Is it this big? Much bigger. Is it this big? Much bigger, until he exploded. So the froggish philosophers can go on speculating about the universal form, but they can't measure it. They can't measure it. It's exhibited by Yoga Maya, the internal potency of the Lord. And Prabhupada quotes Bhagavad Gita chapter 11 verse 16, where Arjuna says, I'll just read the translation, O my Lord, O gigantic Vishvarup form, means universal form. O Master of the universe, I see innumerable hands, bodies, mouths, and eyes in all directions, and they're all unlimited. I cannot find the end of this manifestation, nor do I see the middle, nor the beginning. Yeah, really, it's amazing, isn't it? So Prabhupada continues in the second paragraph. The Bhagavad Gita was specifically spoken to Arjuna, and the Vishvarup, the universal form, was exhibited before him at his request. Then he was given the eyes to see it, because he couldn't see that form with his regular eyes. But anyway, Arjuna he saw the universal form, but he couldn't see everything in it. And if he couldn't, how could we? So if you like, you can continue following the frog philosophers based on your limited experiences. You can until you burst like Dr. Frog, but best to become a cool-headed, submissive devotee of the Lord. Try to hear about the Lord from the bona fide spiritual master, and thus serve the Lord in transcendental loving service, as suggested in the previous verse. And we'll carry on from there tomorrow. Hare Krishna, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.